My name is Emily Hayes, and I'm 26 years old. I've lived in Crescent Vale, a small riverside town surrounded by dense forests and steep cliffs for most of my life. The town is quiet, almost idyllic, with its winding trails and serene riverbanks. But last summer, on a night I'll never forget, I discovered that Crescent Vale hides more than just natural beauty. It was late August, and the air was heavy with the smell of rain. I had gone for an evening hike to clear my mind after a stressful week. The trail I chose was one I'd walked countless times before, a narrow path that led to the cliffs overlooking the Crescent River. It was my favorite spot to watch the sunset, but that evening the sky was overcast, casting the forest in a dull grey light. By the time I reached the overlook, the sun had vanished completely, leaving only the faint glow of the moon to light the valley below. I sat on a flat rock near the edge, listening to the rustling of leaves and the distant sound of the river. For a while, it was peaceful, almost meditative. But then the forest went silent. The change was sudden and complete, as if someone had flipped a switch. No wind, no rustling leaves, no chirping crickets, just an oppressive, unnatural stillness that made my skin crawl. I stood up, scanning the tree line with my flashlight, but there was nothing there. At least, not at first. I heard it before I saw it, a faint rustling, slow and deliberate, coming from the trees behind me. My flashlight beam darted through the darkness, landing on shifting shadows that seemed to dance just out of reach. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. The rustling stopped, replaced by a deep, guttural growl that seemed to reverberate through the ground. I turned toward the sound, my heart racing. That's when I saw the eyes, two glowing yellow orbs staring back at me from the shadows. They were impossibly high off the ground, and as the figure stepped closer, its massive form emerged from the darkness. The creature was unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was enormous, its body covered in dark, shaggy fur that seemed to absorb the moonlight. It walked on two legs, its movements unnervingly smooth, almost human. Its face, though, was something out of a nightmare, a twisted blend of wolf and man, with a long snout lined with sharp, glistening teeth. Its claws were as long as daggers, and its hunched shoulders gave it a predatory stance that made my blood run cold. I froze, unable to move as the creature stared at me, its glowing eyes unblinking. It tilted its head slightly, as if curious, then let out a low growl that sent a shiver down my spine. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like lead. Then it lunged. The spell broke, and I bolted, sprinting down the trail as fast as I could. The sound of its footsteps thundered behind me, each one louder and closer than the last. My flashlight bounced wildly in my hand, casting frantic beams of light that only made the shadows more menacing. The trail twisted and turned, but I didn't dare look back. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they might give out at any moment. But the fear kept me going. The creature's growls grew louder, and I could hear its claws scraping against the dirt, closing the distance with terrifying speed. I spotted the small footbridge that marked the trailhead and my way back to the car. Summoning every ounce of strength I had left, I sprinted toward it. The creature roared, a deafening sound that seemed to shake the very air around me. I reached the bridge just as it lunged again, its claws swiping at the air inches from my back. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. My hands fumbled with the keys, and I could barely breathe as I finally slid into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life, and I sped down the gravel road, glancing in the rearview mirror every few seconds. The trailhead disappeared into the darkness, and with it, the glowing yellow eyes. When I got home, I locked every door and window and sat awake until dawn, clutching a kitchen knife like it would somehow protect me. The next day, I returned to the trail with a few friends, armed with flashlights and rifles. We found the footprints, massive clawed impressions that tore through the dirt and moss, but nothing else. I haven't been back to Crescent Vale's trails since that night. I don't know what that creature was or why it let me go. All I know is that it's still out there, watching, waiting, and I'll never feel safe in those woods again. My name is Olivia Kane, and I'm 30 years old. I grew up in Redstone, a small town nestled near the rugged cliffs of Hollow Quarry, an abandoned mining site that's been left to nature for decades. The quarry has always been a source of mystery and local lore. Stories of miners disappearing, strange echoes in the night, and sightings of something inhuman lurking among the rocks. Like most, I dismissed them as tall tales. But last spring I learned the truth. It was late April, and I'd agreed to take my younger brother Jake on a nighttime hike. He was visiting from out of town and had heard about the quarry's reputation. "Come on, Liv," he'd said, grinning. "It'll be fun. What's the worst that could happen?" The trail to the quarry was quiet, the night air crisp with the lingering chill of early spring. We brought flashlights, but the full moon lit our path well enough. As we descended into the quarry, the familiar sound of crunching gravel underfoot echoed in the stillness. The cliffs loomed above us, their jagged edges casting long, eerie shadows. About halfway in, Jake stopped suddenly. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I listened, but all I heard was the faint rustling of wind through the grass. "It's nothing," I said, brushing off his concern. But a nagging unease had begun to creep over me. The quarry felt different that night, darker, heavier, as if the air itself were pressing in on us. We continued on, our laughter and conversation quieter now. The path wound deeper into the quarry, the cliffs closing in around us. That's when we heard it, a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the rocks. Jake froze, his flashlight shaking in his hand. "What was that?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Before I could answer, the growl came again, louder this time. It was followed by the sound of something heavy moving, rocks shifting, gravel scattering. My flashlight swept across the quarry walls, but there was nothing there. "Let's go," I said, grabbing Jake's arm. "Now." We turned to head back, but the sound of movement grew louder, closer. Something was following us, its footsteps heavy and deliberate. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end as I glanced over my shoulder. That's when I saw it. At the edge of the moonlight, a massive figure stood on the quarry ridge. Its body was covered in dark, matted fur, and its limbs were long and powerful. It moved with an unsettling grace, its glowing yellow eyes locked onto us. The creature let out a low, menacing growl that echoed through the quarry, sending a chill down my spine. "Run!" I whispered, and Jake didn't hesitate. We sprinted down the path, the flashlight beams bouncing wildly as we stumbled over loose rocks. Behind us, the creature gave chase, its footsteps thunderous against the quarry floor. Its growls turned into a deafening roar, a sound that seemed to shake the very ground beneath us. We reached an old mining tunnel at the base of the quarry, its entrance partially collapsed but still passable. Without thinking, I pulled Jake inside, hoping the narrow space would keep the creature out. We crouched in the darkness, our breaths coming in ragged gasps as we listened to the sound of it outside. The creature didn't leave. Instead, it paced back and forth, its growls echoing through the tunnel. I could hear its claws scraping against the rocks, testing the entrance. My heart raced as I clutched Jake's arm, willing it to go away. Minutes felt like hours, and then silence. The growls stopped, and the pacing ceased. We waited, too afraid to move, until the first light of dawn began to filter through the tunnel entrance. Cautiously, we emerged, scanning the quarry for any sign of the creature. It was gone, but the marks it left behind were unmistakable. Deep claw gouges in the rock, tracks larger than any animal I'd ever seen. We didn't speak on the hike back to the car. There was nothing to say. Jake left town the next day, and we've avoided talking about what happened, but I've thought about it every day since. The people of Redstone have always warned about Hollow Quarry, but I never listened. Now I know better. Something lives in that quarry, something that watches and waits in the shadows. And if you're unlucky enough to cross its path, you might not make it out alive. My name is David Lorne, and I'm 37 years old. I've lived in Ashwood Glade, a quiet town surrounded by dense forests in northern Vermont, for most of my life. I've always loved the woods here, their stillness, their beauty. As a seasoned hunter, I've spent countless hours exploring them. But one evening last autumn, I encountered something that made me question whether the woods I thought I knew so well could ever truly be safe. It was late October, and the air was cool and crisp, the kind of evening perfect for hunting. I set out around dusk, my rifle slung over my shoulder, heading toward a spot known for deer sightings. The trail wound through the heart of Ashwood Forest, a place thick with towering pines and moss-covered rocks. The setting sun cast long shadows across the path, and the forest gradually darkened as I walked deeper. The first sign that something was wrong came as I reached a small clearing. The usual sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the chirping of crickets, had vanished. The silence was unnerving, heavy, as though the trees themselves were holding their breath. I paused, scanning the clearing, my finger resting on the trigger of my rifle. That's when I saw the tracks. They were massive, far larger than any bear or wolf prints I'd ever seen, and deeply pressed into the soft earth. Each step ended in long, claw-like impressions, as though the creature's feet were designed to rip through flesh and bone. The tracks led into the woods, disappearing into the shadows. I told myself it had to be a bear. A big one, sure, but nothing I couldn't handle. Still, a knot of unease twisted in my stomach as I continued along the trail, my senses heightened. The shadows deepened, and the light from my flashlight seemed to do little to push back the encroaching darkness. Then I heard it. A low, guttural growl, so deep it seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath my boots. I froze, heart pounding, my flashlight darting through the trees. "Who's there?" I called, my voice sounding small against the oppressive silence. The growl came again, louder this time and closer. I turned, shining the beam into the woods. At first I saw nothing but shadows. But then, just beyond the edge of the light, two glowing yellow eyes appeared. They were impossibly high off the ground, and as the creature stepped closer, its massive form came into view. The beast was enormous, its frame hulking and covered in dark, matted fur. It walked on two legs, its movements unnervingly smooth and deliberate. Its long arms ended in claws that glinted faintly in the dim light, and its face was a terrifying blend of wolf and man, a long snout filled with jagged teeth and ears that twitched as though listening to my every move. My breath caught in my throat as the creature locked eyes with me. For a moment it didn't move, as if savoring the fear radiating off me. Then, with a snarl that shook me to my core, it charged. I fired, the shot echoing through the forest. The creature recoiled, letting out a furious roar as the bullet grazed its shoulder. It didn't stop. I turned and ran, the sound of its heavy footsteps pounding behind me. Branches snapped, and the ground shook as it pursued me, its growls growing louder with every step. The trail twisted and turned, and I pushed myself harder, lungs burning, my legs screaming in protest. I could feel the creature gaining on me, its hot breath on the back of my neck. Then I spotted the old fire tower up ahead, its silhouette barely visible through the trees. I reached the tower and scrambled up the rusted ladder, my boots slipping on the icy rungs. The creature roared below, slamming its massive body against the base of the tower. I climbed higher, my hands numb with cold, until I reached the platform at the top. From above, I watched as the beast circled the tower, its glowing eyes never leaving me. It growled and clawed at the structure, but the old steel held firm. For hours it stayed there, pacing and snarling, until the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees. Only then did it retreat, melting back into the shadows from which it came. When I was certain it was gone, I climbed down and made my way back to town, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The tracks were still visible in the morning light, deep impressions that led into the woods and disappeared. I've told no one but a few close friends about what happened that night. Most don't believe me, dismissing it as the imagination of a tired hunter. But I know what I saw. That thing wasn't a bear or a wolf. It was something far more terrifying, something that doesn't belong in our world. I haven't been back to Ashwood Forest since. The place that once felt like home now feels like a trap, a place where something ancient and monstrous still hunts, and I can only hope I never see it again. My name is Nathan Carter, and I'm 28 years old. I've lived in Silent Ridge, a remote town nestled in the Blue Ridge Mountains, my entire life. Growing up, the woods were my playground, a place to fish, hunt, and explore. I knew every trail and clearing like the back of my hand, and I always felt at home under the canopy of towering oaks and maples. That is, until last October, when I came face to face with something that made me question everything I thought I knew about those woods. It started on a crisp autumn evening. I had been out hunting all day, tracking deer along a ridge that overlooked the valley below. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, and I decided to head back before darkness set in. I was about halfway down the trail when I noticed something strange. The forest had gone completely silent. At first, I didn't think much of it. Animals quiet down all the time when they sense a predator. But as I continued walking, the stillness became oppressive, the kind of silence that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The usual rustling of leaves and distant calls of birds were absent, replaced by a heavy, unnatural quiet. That's when I heard it. A deep, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I froze, my hand tightening around the rifle slung over my shoulder. Slowly, I scanned the trees, my breath fogging in the cool air. "Who's there?" I called, my voice shaking slightly. The only answer was another growl, louder this time, and closer. I turned, my heart pounding, and that's when I saw it. At the edge of the trail, partially obscured by shadows, a massive figure stood watching me. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, reflecting the faint light of the rising moon. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It wasn't a bear, its posture was all wrong, too upright, too deliberate, and it wasn't human either. The creature stepped into the moonlight, and I felt my stomach drop. It was enormous, at least 8 feet tall, with a muscular frame covered in dark, matted fur. Its long arms ended in clawed hands that looked capable of tearing through steel, and its face was a nightmarish blend of wolf and man. A low growl rumbled from its chest as it took another step toward me. I raised my rifle, my hands trembling. "Stay back!" I shouted, though my voice cracked with fear. The creature stopped, tilting its head slightly, as if amused by my threat. Then, with a snarl that sent a wave of terror through me, it lunged. I fired, the sound of the shot echoing through the trees. The creature recoiled, letting out a furious roar as the bullet grazed its shoulder. I didn't wait to see if it would recover. I turned and ran, adrenaline fueling my legs as I sprinted down the trail. The sound of its pursuit was deafening, branches snapping, heavy footsteps pounding the ground. I could feel it gaining on me, its growls growing louder and more enraged. The trail twisted and turned, and I prayed that the darkness would slow it down. But it seemed to move effortlessly, a shadow among shadows. I spotted the old hunter's cabin up ahead, its silhouette barely visible through the trees. I veered off the trail, crashing through the underbrush as I made a beeline for the cabin. My chest burned, and my legs felt like they might give out, but I didn't stop until I was inside. Slamming the door shut, I bolted it and shoved a heavy wooden table against it for good measure. The creature reached the cabin moments later. Its growls were so loud I could feel them reverberating through the walls. The door shook violently as it slammed its weight against it, and I scrambled to reload my rifle, my hand shaking so badly I nearly dropped the bullets. The growling stopped. I held my breath listening, but the only sound was my own racing heartbeat. Then the window shattered, and I turned just in time to see its claws reaching inside. I fired, the blast lighting up the cabin for a split second. The creature let out an ear-splitting roar and disappeared into the night. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed huddled in the corner of the cabin, clutching my rifle, waiting for it to return. But when dawn broke, the forest was silent again. I stepped outside, the morning light revealing the destruction it had left behind. Deep claw marks in the wooden door, shattered glass, and massive footprints leading back into the woods. I never reported what happened. Who would believe me? Instead, I packed up my things and left Silent Ridge for good. The woods that once felt like home now feel like a trap, a place where something ancient and terrible still roams. I've warned a few people who plan to hike in the area, but most just laugh and call it an old hunter's tale. But I know the truth, and I hope, for their sake, they never have to learn it the hard way. My name is Rachel Porter, and I'm 27 years old. I live in a small farming community called Elkwood, tucked away in the vast plains of Kansas. Life here has always been quiet, long stretches of open fields, dirt roads, and the occasional distant howl of coyotes at night. But one evening last fall, I encountered something that defied explanation and left me questioning everything I thought I knew about the land I call home. It was a chilly October evening, and I'd stayed late at my friend Lisa's house, helping her prep for a community harvest festival. By the time I left, the sun had long since dipped below the horizon, and the sky was an endless sea of stars. The drive home was a familiar one, a straight, narrow road cutting through miles of open farmland with no streetlights to guide the way. The first hour passed uneventfully. My high beams illuminated the road ahead, and the radio hummed softly in the background. But as I turned onto an unmarked dirt road that would shave a few minutes off my drive, I noticed something strange. The air seemed heavier, the silence oppressive. Even the wind, which usually swept across the plains in gusts, was eerily still. About halfway down the road, my headlights caught movement in the distance. A figure stood at the edge of the field just beyond the reach of the light. At first I thought it was a scarecrow. Its tall, lanky frame seemed oddly stiff, its posture unnatural. But as I got closer, it moved. The figure stepped onto the road, its glowing yellow eyes locking onto mine. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. Its body was impossibly tall, covered in dark, wiry fur that seemed to ripple with each movement. Its limbs were elongated, its hands ending in razor-sharp claws, and its face, an unnerving blend of wolf and man, bore an expression of pure malice. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop just feet away from the creature. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at it, frozen with fear. The creature tilted its head, studying me with those glowing eyes. For a moment, neither of us moved. The world around us seemed to vanish, leaving only the two of us locked in a silent standoff. Then it let out a deep, guttural growl that vibrated through the air. My survival instincts kicked in. I threw the car into reverse, my tires spinning in the loose dirt as I tried to back away. The creature snarled and lunged forward, its claws raking across the hood, with a sound that sent chills down my spine. It was impossibly fast, keeping pace with the car as I struggled to steer and reverse at the same time. I managed to turn the car around, slamming the gear into drive and flooring the gas pedal. The headlights caught the creature one last time as it gave chase, its powerful limbs propelling it forward with horrifying speed. My hands were white-knuckled on the steering wheel, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps as the road stretched endlessly before me. Suddenly, the creature stopped. It stood in the middle of the road, watching as I sped away. Its glowing eyes burned into my rearview mirror, and for a split second I thought I saw it smile, an eerie, knowing grin that sent a wave of terror through me. Then it turned and disappeared into the darkness of the fields. When I finally reached the safety of my driveway, I sat in the car, trembling and trying to catch my breath. The hood of the car bore deep claw marks, a stark reminder that what I'd seen wasn't just my imagination. That night, I locked every door and window, keeping the lights on until the first rays of dawn. The next morning, I returned to the dirt road with Lisa and her husband, who didn't believe a word of my story but agreed to humor me. The road was empty, but the ground bore evidence of the encounter. Massive footprints, too large for any animal native to the area, and gouges in the dirt where the creature had clawed at the road. Since that night, I've avoided that stretch of road, and I no longer drive alone after dark. The people of Elkwood have their share of ghost stories and tall tales, but I know what I saw. Whatever that creature was, it's still out there, stalking the fields and waiting in the shadows, and I pray that no one else crosses its path. My name is Vanessa Pierce, and I'm 33 years old. I grew up in Blackwood Canyon, a small mountain town surrounded by dense forests and sheer cliffs in Colorado. The canyon has always been a place of beauty and danger, a mix of serene hiking trails and treacherous drop-offs. It's a place where nature feels untamed, but last winter I discovered that something far worse hides in its shadows. It was early December, and the first heavy snowfall of the season had transformed the canyon into a winter wonderland. I had decided to take a solo hike to clear my head, something I often did when the stress of life felt overwhelming. I packed my gear and set off in the late afternoon, planning to be back before nightfall. The trail was quiet, muffled by the snow that blanketed the trees and ground. The only sounds were my boots crunching through the powder and the occasional rustle of wind in the pines. As I hiked deeper into the canyon, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air felt heavier, and the usual sense of peace I found in the forest was absent. About an hour into the hike, I reached a clearing with a small frozen stream. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the snow. That's when I noticed the tracks. They were large, much larger than any animal I'd ever encountered, and they had claw marks etched deep into the snow. They led from the edge of the clearing into the trees, disappearing into the darkness. I told myself it was probably a bear, though I knew bears should have been hibernating by then. Still, the unease lingered as I turned back toward the trail. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Slowly I scanned the tree line, but the shadows seemed to shift and move, playing tricks on my eyes. The growl came again, louder this time and closer. My heart raced as I fumbled for the flashlight in my pack, switching it on and shining it into the woods. That's when I saw it. At first it was just a shadow, unnaturally tall and broad, standing at the edge of the clearing. But as it stepped into the light, its features became horrifyingly clear. The creature was massive, its body covered in dark, matted fur that glistened with melted snow. It stood on two legs, its hunched shoulders and long arms giving it an almost human posture, but its face was a grotesque mix of man and wolf, with a long snout and glowing yellow eyes that locked onto me with predatory intent. I stumbled back, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The creature tilted its head as if studying me, then let out a deep snarl that reverberated through the clearing. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs felt rooted to the ground. Then it moved. In one terrifyingly fast motion, it lunged toward me, its claws tearing through the snow. I turned and bolted down the trail, my heart pounding as I ran faster than I ever thought possible. The sound of its pursuit was deafening, branches snapping, snow crunching, and guttural growls that seemed to shake the air around me. I didn't dare look back. The trail twisted and turned, and I pushed myself harder, desperate to put as much distance between me and the creature as possible. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they might give out, but the fear kept me moving. As the forest thinned, I spotted the small ranger's station near the trailhead, its lights faint but visible through the trees. Summoning every ounce of strength I had left, I sprinted toward it. The creature roared behind me, a sound so loud it seemed to vibrate through my chest. I burst through the station door and slammed it shut, collapsing onto the floor. The ranger on duty, a middle-aged man named Tom, helped me to my feet as I tried to catch my breath. "What happened?" he asked, his eyes wide with concern. Before I could answer, the growling started again, followed by the sound of something heavy slamming against the door. Tom grabbed his rifle and moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. His face paled. "What in God's name is that?" he muttered, raising the rifle as the door shook violently under the weight of the creature's attack. For what felt like hours, the creature circled the station, its growls and snarls echoing through the small building. Tom fired a warning shot through the window, and the creature let out a furious roar before retreating into the night. We waited in silence, too afraid to move, until the first light of dawn broke through the trees. When we finally stepped outside, the snow around the station was torn up, deep claw marks gouging the wooden walls and door. Massive footprints led away from the building, disappearing into the forest. I've never gone back to Blackwood Canyon, and I've told only a few people what happened that night. Most don't believe me, chalking it up to exhaustion or a bear encounter. But Tom saw it too, and the fear in his eyes told me I wasn't imagining things. Whatever that creature was, it's still out there, hiding in the shadows of the canyon, and I know I'll never feel safe in the wilderness again. My name is Daniel Harris. I'm 33 years old and I live in Charleston, South Carolina. I've always been passionate about nature photography, often venturing into remote locations to capture the serenity of untouched landscapes. It's my escape, a way to clear my mind and feel connected to something bigger. But one night in Ravenwood, I learned that the wilderness holds more than beauty. It harbors unspeakable terror. It was early October, and the leaves had just begun to turn shades of gold and crimson. A friend had told me about Ravenwood, a secluded forest not far from Asheville, North Carolina, that offered breathtaking views and a pristine night sky untouched by light pollution. It sounded perfect for my photography project, which focused on nocturnal landscapes. I packed my gear and drove up early that afternoon, eager to scout a good spot before nightfall. The entrance to the forest was unmarked, just a dirt road winding into an endless sea of trees. As I drove deeper, the sounds of the modern world faded away, replaced by the gentle rustle of leaves and the occasional chirp of crickets. It was peaceful, almost dreamlike, as if the forest existed in a world of its own. I parked at the base of a hill and hiked to a clearing I'd spotted on the map. The view was everything I'd hoped for. A wide expanse of open sky framed by towering trees. As the sun set, I set up my tripod and began taking photos, adjusting my lens to capture the stars as they slowly emerged. It was around 10 p.m. when I first felt it, a shift in the air, subtle but undeniable. The usual sounds of the forest had gone silent. No crickets, no wind, just an oppressive stillness that made my skin crawl. I paused, scanning the tree line with my flashlight, but saw nothing unusual. Brushing off the unease, I went back to my camera. A low, distant howl pierced the silence. I froze, heart pounding. It wasn't a wolf or coyote. I'd heard those before. This was deeper, rawer, and seemed to carry an almost human quality. I convinced myself it was my imagination. After all, Ravenwood was supposed to be deserted. Who or what could possibly be out here? But then I heard it again, closer this time. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I swept it across the trees. That's when I saw them, two glowing eyes staring back at me from the darkness. They were unnaturally high, at least 8 feet off the ground, and burned with an intense yellow light that seemed to cut through the shadows. My breath caught. For a moment, I couldn't move, trapped in their gaze. The creature stepped into the clearing. It was massive, easily the size of a bear, but its movements were too fluid, too deliberate. Its body was covered in dark, matted fur, and its shoulders hunched forward like a predator ready to strike. Its face was the worst, a grotesque blend of human and wolf, with a long snout filled with jagged teeth that glinted in the moonlight. A low growl rumbled from its chest, vibrating the air around me. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like lead. The creature took a step closer, and I snapped back to reality. Grabbing my camera, I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the tripod. I turned and ran, my flashlight bobbing wildly as I crashed through the underbrush. Behind me, I heard it following, branches snapping, heavy footsteps pounding the ground. It wasn't running, it was stalking, toying with me. I could feel its eyes on my back, every muscle in my body screaming that it was gaining on me. I spotted an old cabin in the distance, its roof barely visible through the trees. Desperate, I sprinted toward it, throwing myself against the door. It creaked open and I slammed it shut, bolting the rusted lock. My chest heaved as I pressed my ear to the wood, listening. At first there was nothing. Then came the sound of claws scraping against the walls. The cabin was small, with a single room filled with broken furniture and dusty windows. I grabbed an old chair and wedged it under the doorknob, though I knew it wouldn't hold for long. The growling grew louder, followed by a loud thud that shook the door on its hinges. My hands fumbled through my bag until I found my pocket knife, but the blade felt laughably small against whatever was outside. Suddenly the window shattered. I screamed as the creature's claws reached inside, groping for anything it could grab. Its eyes glared at me through the broken glass, filled with a savage intelligence. Without thinking, I grabbed a bottle from the floor, an old whiskey bottle still half full, and threw it at the beast. It hit its snout, and it recoiled with a furious snarl. Then a loud bang echoed through the cabin. The creature let out a howl of pain and vanished into the night. A man stepped through the door holding a shotgun. He was tall and rugged, his face weathered by years of outdoor living. "You're lucky I was nearby," he said, reloading his weapon. "That thing doesn't scare off easy." He introduced himself as Walter, a hunter who'd been tracking the creature for years. According to him, it wasn't the first time someone had encountered it in Ravenwood. "You need to leave," he warned, glancing at the broken window. "Once it sees you, it never stops hunting." I didn't argue. We left together, and he guided me back to my car, his shotgun never leaving his hands. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those glowing eyes following me. But the forest was dark and still. To this day, I don't know what I saw that night. I stopped going on solo photography trips, and Ravenwood remains a place I'll never return to. But every now and then, when the night is quiet and the air feels too still, I think about those eyes and wonder if it's still out there, waiting. My name is Sarah Langston, and I'm 31 years old. I grew up in Ironwood, Michigan, surrounded by the dense forests of the Upper Peninsula. As a kid, I'd spend hours exploring the trails with my dad, who taught me how to track deer and identify animal calls. The woods were my sanctuary, a place where I felt safe and connected to nature. But that sense of security was shattered one night last summer, and I haven't stepped foot in the forest since. It started on a warm July evening. I'd been hiking along Ironwood Trail, a secluded path that cuts deep into the forest, known for its old-growth pines and serene atmosphere. I often went there to clear my head after long days at work, and that night was no different. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the trail as I made my way back toward the parking lot. That's when I heard it. A snap of a branch, sharp and deliberate, coming from the woods to my left. I stopped, straining to listen, but the forest fell silent. It wasn't unusual to hear animals moving through the underbrush, but something about this sound felt off. It wasn't the quick, skittering movement of a deer or raccoon. It was heavier, slower, like someone or something was following me. I shook off the unease and kept walking, quickening my pace. The trail twisted and turned, and with each step, I felt the weight of the forest pressing in on me. The air grew thick, and the usual sounds of birds and insects seemed to vanish, replaced by an oppressive silence. Then I heard it again, a soft rustling, this time closer. My heart began to race. I turned, shining my flashlight into the trees, but saw nothing, just shadows and the faint glimmer of moonlight filtering through the canopy. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. No response. I kept walking, my steps hurried now, the flashlight darting back and forth. The trail felt endless, and the sinking realization that I was still miles from the parking lot made my stomach churn. Every instinct told me to run, but I knew better than to panic in the woods. And then I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, something moved, a tall, hulking figure slipping between the trees. I froze, gripping the flashlight tightly, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the light. But as I stood there, I saw it again, closer this time. My breath caught in my throat as I took in its shape. The figure was massive, at least 7 feet tall, its shoulders impossibly broad. Its body was covered in dark, matted fur that seemed to blend with the shadows, and its limbs were unnaturally long, ending in claws that glinted faintly in the moonlight. Its head was wolf-like, with a long snout and pointed ears that swiveled toward me as it stepped into the trail. Its eyes glowed, a piercing yellow that locked onto mine with a predatory intensity. My legs felt like lead, my body frozen in terror. The creature tilted its head as if studying me, then let out a low, guttural growl that sent a chill down my spine. I don't remember deciding to run. One moment I was staring at it, and the next I was sprinting down the trail, my flashlight bouncing wildly. The sound of its footsteps followed, heavy and deliberate, closing the distance with terrifying ease. The growling grew louder, accompanied by the snap of branches as it tore through the underbrush. I spotted a small wooden bridge up ahead, its railing broken and weathered with age. Beyond it, the trail opened into a clearing where the parking lot was just visible through the trees. I pushed myself harder, lungs burning, as the creature's growls turned into a deafening roar. As I reached the bridge, my foot caught on a loose plank, and I stumbled, crashing onto the wooden boards. The flashlight flew from my hand, skittering into the darkness. I scrambled to my feet, my knees shaking, and turned just in time to see the creature step onto the bridge. It stopped, its glowing eyes fixed on me. For a moment it seemed hesitant, its claws curling around the wooden railing as if testing its strength. Then, with a low snarl, it took a step forward, the old boards creaking under its weight. Desperate, I grabbed a loose plank from the ground and swung it at the creature as hard as I could. The wood connected with its snout, and it let out a furious howl, stumbling back. I didn't wait to see if it would recover. I ran, half blind, toward the parking lot, my only thought to get to my car. When I finally reached it, I fumbled with the keys, tears streaming down my face. The engine roared to life, and I sped away, the trail disappearing in my rearview mirror. I didn't stop driving until I reached the safety of my driveway, where I locked myself in the car and sat shaking for what felt like hours. The next morning, I returned with a group of friends, armed with rifles and flashlights. We found the bridge, its planks splintered and claw marks gouged deep into the wood. But of the creature, there was no sign, only a faint, lingering smell of wet fur and decay. I've told no one else about what happened that night. People here love their ghost stories and urban legends, but this was something different, something real. I haven't been back to Ironwood Trail, and I don't think I ever will. But sometimes, late at night, I think about those glowing yellow eyes and wonder if they're still out there watching. My name is Ethan Clark, and I'm 32 years old. I've lived in Hollow Creek, a quiet little town in Kentucky, all my life. Growing up, I loved the solitude of the countryside, the endless woods and the winding trails that seemed to stretch forever. But now, the very land that once gave me peace has become a place of nightmares. It started last October. I'd taken a trip to the outskirts of Hollow Creek near an old trail that cut through the densest part of the woods. The locals called it Whispering Hollow, a name that came from the eerie sound of the wind weaving through the trees. Most people avoided it, but I'd always been drawn to its desolate beauty. That night I learned why everyone stayed away. I was out there alone, hoping to clear my mind after a rough week. The air was crisp and the full moon illuminated the forest in an otherworldly glow. I parked my truck at the trailhead and started walking, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The woods were alive with the sounds of rustling leaves and distant animal calls, comforting at first, but then unsettling as they faded into complete silence. I stopped and scanned the trees with my flashlight. Nothing moved. The stillness felt wrong, heavy, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Then I heard it, a low growl, deep and guttural, coming from somewhere ahead of me. It wasn't the sound of any animal I'd ever heard. My stomach turned to ice and my grip tightened on the flashlight. Probably just a coyote, I whispered to myself, trying to stay calm. But as I took a cautious step forward, I heard it again, louder this time and closer. The beam of my flashlight caught a pair of glowing eyes in the distance, yellow and piercing, staring right at me. My heart raced as the figure began to move, stepping out from behind the trees. The creature was massive, its form a horrifying blend of man and wolf. It stood on two legs, its hunched shoulders covered in thick, matted fur that gleamed in the moonlight. Its hands ended in long, razor-sharp claws, and its snout was filled with teeth that looked capable of tearing through anything. It let out a low, menacing growl that reverberated through the woods. I took a step back, my pulse pounding in my ears. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like lead. The creature tilted its head as if studying me, then snarled and lunged. That's when my body finally reacted. I turned and bolted down the trail, my flashlight bouncing wildly as I ran. The sound of its footsteps was thunderous, snapping branches and crunching leaves as it pursued me. I didn't dare look back. My lungs burned, and every muscle in my body screamed for me to stop. But I pushed on, knowing that slowing down meant death. The trail seemed endless, stretching on, but then I spotted the faint outline of an old hunting cabin through the trees. I veered off the trail and sprinted toward it, my breath ragged. The door was slightly ajar, creaking on its hinges as I slammed it shut behind me. I locked it with a rusted bolt and shoved a heavy wooden chest against it for good measure. The interior of the cabin was dark, illuminated only by the pale light filtering through the cracks in the walls. The creature reached the cabin moments later. Its growls echoed through the night as it circled the structure, scratching at the walls and testing the windows. I grabbed an old hunting knife from the table and stood in the center of the room, my hands trembling. The door shook violently as the creature slammed against it, each impact louder than the last. And then silence. I strained to listen, my ears ringing in the oppressive quiet. For a moment, I thought it had given up. But then a window shattered, and the creature's massive arm reached inside, its claws swiping at the air. I backed away, clutching the knife, but I knew it was useless against something so powerful. The door burst open, and the creature stepped inside, its eyes locked on mine, glowing with predatory rage. It moved slowly, savoring my fear, its growls turning into something almost like laughter. My back hit the wall, and I raised the knife, knowing it wouldn't be enough. Just as the creature lunged, a deafening gunshot rang out. The creature let out a howl of pain and staggered backward, blood staining its fur. A man appeared in the doorway, his face shadowed, holding a shotgun. "Get out of here!" he yelled, firing another round that sent the creature retreating into the woods. I didn't ask questions. I ran past him, my legs shaky, and bolted for my truck. The man followed, keeping his gun trained on the trees until we reached the vehicle. "You're lucky I was out hunting tonight," he said, as I started the engine. "These things don't let go of their prey easily." I drove away as fast as I could, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly they ached. The man disappeared into the forest, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I didn't stop driving until I reached the safety of my home, where I locked every door and window. Since that night, I haven't returned to Whispering Hollow. I can still hear the growls in my dreams and see those glowing yellow eyes whenever I close my own. The scars on the cabin's walls and the claw marks on my truck are proof that it wasn't just a nightmare. Something is out there, lurking in the shadows of Hollow Creek, and I know it hasn't forgotten me. My name is Luke Harris, and I'm 34 years old. I grew up in Winter Hollow, a small mountain town in northern Montana. The winters here are harsh, but the solitude has always been worth it. I've spent most of my life hiking the nearby trails, camping in the dense forests, and finding peace in the isolation. But one night last December, I encountered something that turned my beloved wilderness into a place of fear. It began during a snowstorm. I had been visiting a friend who lived deep in the woods and stayed longer than I'd planned. By the time I started the drive home, heavy snow had blanketed the narrow mountain roads, making them treacherous. My truck's tires crunched through the snow, the headlights casting long beams into the swirling white. The first hour was uneventful. I drove slowly, focused on the road ahead. But as I turned onto an old logging road that cut through Winter Hollow forest, a strange feeling crept over me. The woods were unnervingly still, and the only sound was the faint hum of my engine. Even the snow seemed to fall in silence. About halfway down the road, my headlights caught something standing in the middle of the path. At first, I thought it was a fallen tree or an animal, but as I got closer, the shape became clearer. It was a figure, tall, broad, and hunched. It stood motionless, its head tilted slightly, as if watching me. I slowed to a crawl, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure stepped into the light, and my breath caught. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. The creature was massive, its fur-covered body glistening with melting snow. Its arms were long, ending in clawed hands that hung at its sides. But it was the face that froze me in place. A grotesque mix of wolf and man, its snout lined with jagged teeth that glinted as it snarled. I stopped the truck, unsure of what to do. The creature took a step forward, its glowing yellow eyes fixed on me with an unnatural intensity. For a moment, I thought it might turn and leave. But then it roared, a deep, guttural sound that seemed to shake the very air around me. Panic overtook me. I shifted the truck into reverse, my tires spinning as I tried to back away. The creature broke into a run, moving faster than I thought possible, its claws slashing through the snow as it charged toward me. My mind raced as I fumbled with the gear shift, finally managing to throw the truck into drive. The engine roared and the vehicle lurched forward. The creature lunged, its claws raking across the side of the truck with a screech that set my teeth on edge. I swerved, nearly losing control on the icy road, but the truck held steady. In the rearview mirror, I saw the creature chasing me, its eyes glowing like embers in the darkness. It kept pace with the truck, its massive form cutting through the snow with terrifying ease. I pushed the truck as fast as the icy road would allow, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly they ached. Just as I thought the creature might catch me, it stopped. I glanced back and saw it standing in the middle of the road, its head tilted as if listening to something. Then, with a low growl, it turned and disappeared into the trees. When I finally reached home, I bolted the door and grabbed the rifle I kept in the hall closet. I sat by the window for hours, watching the snow pile up outside, expecting to see those glowing eyes reappear. But the night passed in silence. The next morning, I went out to inspect the truck. Deep claw marks ran the length of the driver's side, and muddy tracks trailed down the driveway, disappearing into the forest. I didn't go back to the logging road. In fact, I haven't been back to Winter Hollow Forest at all. The people in town have their stories, tales of strange sightings and unexplained disappearances. I always thought they were just part of the local folklore, exaggerated campfire tales to entertain tourists. But now I know better. Something lives in those woods, something that watches, waits, and follows. And I can only hope I never see it again. My name is Marcus Reed, and I'm 36 years old. I've spent my entire life exploring the woods and lakes around Black Hollow, a remote town in northern Wisconsin. The forest here has always been my refuge, a place of calm and connection. But one night last fall, that peace was shattered, and I've never looked at the wilderness the same way since. It was late November, and the nights had grown long and cold. My friends and I had decided to spend the weekend at an old cabin by Black Hollow Lake. It was a tradition for us, a chance to fish, drink, and swap stories around the fire before winter set in. That weekend, only 3 of us could make it. Me, my childhood friend Eric, and his cousin Alex, who had just moved back to town. The cabin was as rustic as it gets. No electricity, no running water, just a wood stove and a single oil lamp to keep the darkness at bay. We spent the day fishing on the frozen lake and chopping firewood, enjoying the crisp air and the quiet solitude. By the time the sun set, we were sitting around the fire pit, sipping whiskey and laughing about old times. The laughter stopped when we heard the first sound. It was a howl, distant and low, but it carried across the frozen lake with an eerie clarity. We all paused, exchanging uneasy glances. "Coyote," Alex said, shrugging it off, but Eric shook his head. "Too deep," he murmured. "That's not a coyote." I laughed nervously, trying to lighten the mood. "Maybe it's Bigfoot," I joked. But the unease lingered as the howling came again, louder this time and closer. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. A mix of a wolf's growl and a human scream, guttural and raw. "Let's head inside," Eric suggested, and none of us argued. We doused the fire and retreated into the cabin, bolting the door behind us. The oil lamp cast flickering shadows on the walls as we sat around the small table, trying to laugh off our nerves. But the atmosphere had changed, the night pressing in on us with an almost tangible weight. That's when Alex noticed it, the light. "Hey, look out there," he said, pointing to the frozen lake. Through the frost-covered window, we saw it, a faint, bluish glow moving across the ice. At first, I thought it might be a flashlight, but it moved too erratically, darting back and forth like it was searching for something. "What the hell is that?" Eric whispered, his voice tight. We watched in silence as the light grew brighter, coming closer to the shore near the cabin. My heart raced as I realized it wasn't a person. It couldn't be. The movement was too fast, too unnatural. The light flickered and pulsed, casting eerie reflections on the ice, and then we saw the shadow. It moved behind the light, a massive, hulking figure silhouetted against the glow. Its shape was vaguely humanoid, but its proportions were all wrong. Too tall, too broad, with limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally. The 3 of us stared in stunned silence as the figure stopped, turning its head toward the cabin. Even from a distance, I felt its gaze, cold and unrelenting. Eric grabbed the shotgun we kept by the door, his hands trembling. "Stay quiet," he hissed, his voice barely audible. We doused the oil lamp, plunging the cabin into darkness. The only light came from the strange glow outside, which now illuminated the clearing around the cabin. The figure moved closer. The sound of heavy footsteps crunching through the snow reached our ears, slow and deliberate. Alex let out a shaky breath, and the creature froze, its head tilted as if listening. A low growl echoed through the night, deep and resonant, vibrating through the walls of the cabin. The door rattled. We all jumped, and Eric raised the shotgun, pointing it at the door. The growling grew louder, and the door shook violently, the hinges creaking under the strain. My mind raced, every instinct screaming at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. We were trapped. Then, as suddenly as it began, the noise stopped. The footsteps retreated, growing fainter until they disappeared altogether. We waited in silence, too afraid to move. After what felt like hours, Eric lit the oil lamp again, the dim light revealing our pale, terrified faces. "Do you think it's gone?" Alex whispered, his voice barely audible. Eric didn't answer. He unbolted the door and cracked it open, peering into the darkness. "I don't see anything," he said, stepping outside cautiously. Alex and I followed, our breath fogging in the frigid air. The clearing was empty, but the snow told a different story. Massive tracks, larger than any animal I'd ever seen, led from the lake to the cabin and then back into the woods. They were humanoid, but distorted, with long claw marks etched into the snow. We followed them to the edge of the forest, where they abruptly disappeared, as if the creature had vanished into thin air. We didn't sleep that night. The three of us sat by the fire, the shotgun resting across Eric's lap, jumping at every creak and groan of the old cabin. When the first light of dawn broke, we packed our things and left, vowing never to return. To this day, I can't explain what we saw. The locals have their theories, ghost stories about the lake, rumors of creatures that wander the woods, but none of them can capture the fear we felt that night. Whatever it wasn't natural. And I'll never forget the way it stared at us, as if it knew we didn't belong. My name is Clara Evans. I'm 29 years old, and I'm from Maple Ridge, a small town at the foot of the Blue Ridge Mountains in North Carolina. Ever since I was young, I've enjoyed driving alone at night. The stillness of deserted roads and the gentle hum of the radio were my way of disconnecting from the world. But now, every curve on the road fills me with dread. It all started one September night as I was returning home after visiting my grandmother in Cedarwood, a village about 50 kilometers from my town. The road connecting the two places is a winding trail through dense forests where you rarely see another car. The night was cold and a thick fog had started to blanket the road. My headlights barely illuminated a few meters ahead. I was distracted by a song on the radio when I noticed something on the side of the road, a crouched figure, almost invisible among the trees. I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer. I slowed down to get a better look, but when the figure rose, a chill ran through me. It was enormous, much larger than any animal I'd ever seen. Its yellow eyes shone brightly, fixed on me, and its stance was a grotesque mix of human and beast. The creature stepped out of the forest and onto the road, standing directly in front of my car. I froze. I flashed my headlights, hoping to scare it back into the woods, but it stood its ground as if daring me. Summoning my courage, I pressed the accelerator. As I drove past it, I heard a heavy thud on the roof of my car. It had jumped onto the vehicle. My heart pounded. I floored the gas pedal, but the weight on the roof made the car sway dangerously. I could hear the scrape of claws on metal, long and deliberate, like sharp blades cutting through. Panic seized me, but I kept driving. The deep growl that echoed inside the car rattled my ribs. Then a deafening sound broke through, a gunshot. The weight on the roof vanished suddenly. Glancing in the rearview mirror, I saw the creature tumble onto the road, howling in pain as a figure emerged from the darkness holding a shotgun. Without thinking, I stopped the car. "Quick, let me in!" the man shouted, running toward me. I unlocked the door and he climbed in, filthy and out of breath. "Don't stop. Don't look back," he commanded. I obeyed, speeding away. The man introduced himself as Roy, a local hunter. He said he had been tracking that thing for days. But what shook me the most was what he said before getting out of the car. "Now that you've seen it, it's seen you too, and it never forgets a face." Since that night, I haven't been able to drive on that road again. Whenever I'm alone at home and hear a noise, my heart races. I don't know if the creature was truly wounded or if it's still out there waiting for me. But one thing is certain, the glow of those yellow eyes will never leave my mind. My name is Lauren Taylor. I'm 35 years old, and I've spent most of my life in Crescent Ridge, a small, sleepy town nestled in the heart of Appalachia. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where stories of strange occurrences are whispered but never taken seriously. I always dismissed the local legends, brushing them off as tales meant to entertain bored minds. That was before the night I came face to face with something that shouldn't exist. It happened in early November. I'd been out late visiting a friend who lived on the other side of town. The drive home took me through Crescent Ridge Forest, a sprawling expanse of thick trees and winding roads. I'd driven that route countless times, confident in its solitude and familiarity. But that night, the forest felt different, oppressive, as though it were holding its breath. The first sign that something was wrong came about 10 minutes into the drive. My car radio, which had been playing soft static from a distant station, suddenly cut out. The headlights flickered briefly before stabilizing, casting long shadows that seemed to dance across the trees. I chalked it up to an electrical glitch and kept driving, eager to get home. As I rounded a bend, something darted across the road. I slammed on the brakes, my tires screeching against the asphalt. The car jolted to a stop, and my heart pounded in my chest. At first, I thought it was a deer, but then I noticed the unnatural way it moved. Too fast, too fluid. Whatever it was had disappeared into the trees, leaving the road eerily silent. I should have kept driving. I should have ignored the curiosity gnawing at me. But instead, I grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out of the car, determined to see what it was. The air outside was cold, biting at my skin as I shone the light into the woods. The beam caught something in the distance. Eyes, yellow glowing eyes, staring back at me with a predatory intensity that made my blood run cold. They were higher than they should have been, easily 7 or 8 feet off the ground. I froze, unable to tear my gaze away, as the figure began to emerge from the shadows. It was massive, its hulking frame covered in matted fur that glistened under the moonlight. Its shoulders were broad, its arms unnaturally long, ending in sharp claws that glinted as it moved. But it was the face that truly paralyzed me. A horrifying blend of human and wolf, its snout lined with jagged teeth that curled into a grim, predatory grin. A low growl rumbled from its chest, reverberating through the still night air. I stumbled backward, my flashlight shaking in my hand, my voice caught in my throat, and all I could do was turn and run back to the car. The growl turned into a snarl, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps pounding the ground behind me. It was chasing me. I barely made it to the car, slamming the door shut just as the creature lunged. Its claws scraped against the metal, leaving deep gouges in the hood. I fumbled with the keys, my hands trembling as it roared and slammed its weight against the vehicle, rocking it violently. The engine sputtered to life and I floored the gas pedal, speeding down the road as fast as I could. In the rearview mirror, I saw it chasing me, its glowing eyes locked on the car. It ran on all fours, its movements impossibly fast, closing the distance with terrifying ease. The road twisted and turned, but I barely noticed, my focus entirely on escaping. My knuckles turned white as I gripped the steering wheel, praying the car wouldn't fail me. I spotted a narrow dirt path branching off to the right and swerved onto it, hoping to lose the creature. The tires kicked up gravel and dirt, the car bouncing violently as I sped through the uneven terrain. For a moment, I thought I'd managed to shake it. But then from the corner of my eye, I saw it again, running parallel to me, weaving through the trees with unrelenting determination. The path ended at an old, dilapidated cabin. I had no choice but to stop. The car skidded to a halt, and I bolted for the cabin, slamming the door shut behind me. The interior was dark and musty, the air thick with the smell of damp wood. I pushed a heavy table against the door, though I knew it wouldn't hold for long. Outside, the creature growled, its claws raking against the walls. It circled the cabin, testing the windows, letting out a roar that shook the very foundation of the building. My chest heaved as I looked around for something, anything I could use to defend myself. My eyes landed on an old hunting rifle mounted on the wall. It looked ancient, but it was my only hope. I grabbed the rifle and checked the chamber. 1 bullet. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. The creature's attacks grew more violent, the door splintering under the force of its blows. I took a deep breath, raised the rifle, and aimed it at the door. The moment it broke through, I fired. The sound was deafening in the small space. The creature let out a howl of pain and staggered backward, blood staining its fur. But it didn't retreat. Instead, it snarled, its eyes burning with rage. It charged at me, and I barely had time to dive out of the way. The rifle clattered to the floor, useless now. In the chaos, I noticed a trap door in the corner of the room. I scrambled toward it, lifting the heavy wooden panel and climbing down into what appeared to be an old root cellar. I pulled the trapdoor shut, just as the creature's claws raked across it. I held my breath, listening to the sound of it above me, snarling, growling, pacing. Then silence. I don't know how long I stayed down there, too afraid to move. When I finally emerged, the cabin was empty. The creature was gone, but the destruction it left behind was undeniable. Deep claw marks scarred the walls, and the door hung loosely from its hinges. I drove home as the first rays of sunlight broke through the trees. To this day, I don't know what I encountered that night. I've told no one, not even my closest friends. But I know this. Whatever it wasn't human, and it's still out there, waiting in the shadows of Crescent Ridge. My name is Grace Miller, and I'm 28 years old. I live in Ashfield, a small town surrounded by the dense forests of shadow pines in northern Minnesota. Life here is quiet, and I've always loved the isolation, until last winter, when something emerged from those woods that shattered my sense of safety forever. It happened during the first big snowstorm of the season. I'd been staying late at the library where I worked, preparing for an upcoming event. By the time I left, thick snowflakes were falling, blanketing the town in a heavy silence. The streets were empty as I drove through the swirling snow, my car's headlights barely cutting through the storm. The quickest route home took me along Pine Hollow Road, a narrow stretch that wound through the edges of the forest. Normally, I enjoyed the drive. The towering pines, dusted with snow, always looked like something out of a postcard. But that night, the road felt ominous, the trees looming like silent sentinels. As I rounded a sharp bend, my headlights caught something in the road ahead. A large shape hunched over what looked like the remains of a deer. I slowed down, thinking it was a bear or a wolf, but as I got closer, I realized it was neither. The creature lifted its head, its glowing yellow eyes locking onto mine. It was massive, its fur dark and matted with blood. Its body was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Long, muscular limbs ending in sharp claws, a hunched back, and a face that was an unnatural mix of wolf and man. Its breath fogged the icy air as it growled, low and menacing. I froze, my hands gripping the steering wheel. My instinct was to back away, but the narrow road offered no escape. The creature straightened, its full height towering over the hood of my car. For a moment, it just stared, as though deciding whether I was a threat or prey. And then it lunged. I slammed the car into reverse, the tires spinning on the slick road as I tried to back away. The creature leaped onto the hood, its claws raking across the windshield, leaving deep gashes in the glass. I screamed, flooring the accelerator. The car jolted backward and the creature slid off with a heavy thud. I didn't wait to see if it would get up. I spun the car around and sped back the way I'd come, my heart pounding as I glanced in the rearview mirror. The road behind me was empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. The snow fell heavier, making it nearly impossible to see, but I kept driving, praying I'd make it home. When I finally reached my house, I ran inside and locked every door and window. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely turn the key in the lock. I grabbed my phone to call the police, but as I dialed, I heard something outside, a deep, guttural growl that made my blood run cold. I peered through the curtains, my breath fogging the cold glass. At first I saw nothing but snow. Then, just beyond the edge of the porch light, I saw it. Those same glowing yellow eyes, watching me from the shadows. It had followed me. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. The police wouldn't believe me. Who would? This wasn't something you could explain. I grabbed a fire poker from the hearth, the only weapon I had, and stood in the center of the room, waiting. The creature didn't try to break in. Instead, it circled the house, its growls echoing in the silence. I could hear its claws scraping against the walls, testing the windows, as though it knew I was trapped. Hours passed like this, the storm howling outside and the creature's presence pressing in on me. Just before dawn, the growling stopped. I waited, my grip on the fire poker tight, but the silence stretched on. Cautiously, I peeked outside. The snow was undisturbed, no tracks leading away from the house. It was as though the creature had simply vanished. In the daylight, it almost felt like a bad dream, but the claw marks on my windshield and the deep gouges in the wooden siding of my house told a different story. The police shrugged it off, saying it must have been a bear. But I know what I saw, and it wasn't any animal that belongs in these woods. Since that night, I've never driven on Pine Hollow Road again. I can't bring myself to leave the safety of my home after dark. Every time the wind howls, I half expect to hear that growl again, to see those glowing eyes staring back at me from the shadows of shadow pines. My name is Andrew Collins, and I'm 29 years old. I live in a small, sleepy town called Willow Creek in Oregon, surrounded by towering redwoods and misty trails. The forest has always felt like a second home to me, peaceful, predictable, and alive in its own quiet way. But last spring I discovered that not everything in the woods can be explained, and some roads are better left forgotten. It started on a rainy Friday evening. I had been visiting my parents, who live about an hour away, and decided to take a shortcut home through an old logging road. The road was barely marked on the map, but I'd heard about it from a few locals who swore it saved time. The idea of a quiet, scenic drive appealed to me, and I thought nothing of the warnings they'd muttered about avoiding it after dark. The rain had let up by the time I turned onto the narrow gravel road. My headlights illuminated the dense undergrowth and gnarled roots that reached toward the edge of the path. The air felt heavier here, the silence broken only by the occasional sound of water dripping from the leaves. About 20 minutes in, I noticed something strange. The road seemed to stretch endlessly, its curves and dips repeating in a way that felt unnatural. I hadn't seen another car or any sign of civilization since I'd entered. A knot of unease began to form in my chest, but I told myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on me. That's when I saw it. In the distance, something large and dark crossed the road, moving with unsettling speed. I slowed down, peering through the rain-slick windshield, but whatever it was had already disappeared into the trees. My pulse quickened. It could have been a bear, I thought. Or maybe a deer, but something about its movement, too smooth, too purposeful, set my nerves on edge. I pressed on, my grip tightening on the steering wheel. The road seemed narrower now, the trees leaning in like silent witnesses. My headlights caught glimpses of the forest, shadows shifting unnaturally in the underbrush. Every now and then, I thought I saw movement, a flicker of something running parallel to the car just beyond the tree line. A loud thud jolted me from my thoughts. The car skidded to a stop, the tires crunching on gravel. My heart pounded as I scanned the road ahead, then glanced in the rearview mirror. Nothing. I told myself it must have been a fallen branch, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. I stepped out of the car, the damp air chilling me to the bone. My flashlight flickered as I scanned the road. That's when I noticed the tracks. They were massive, too large for any animal I'd ever seen, with deep claw marks etched into the mud. They led from the woods on one side of the road to the other, disappearing into the darkness. A low growl cut through the silence. I froze, the beam of my flashlight trembling as I turned toward the sound. At first I saw nothing, just the endless wall of trees. But then two glowing yellow eyes emerged from the shadows, fixed on me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. The creature stepped forward, its form slowly taking shape in the dim light. It was enormous, its body covered in thick, wet fur that clung to its muscular frame. It walked on two legs, its movements eerily human, but with an animalistic grace that sent a chill down my spine. Its claws were long and sharp, and its face, some grotesque mix of wolf and man, was contorted into a snarl. My breath hitched as the creature growled again, its lips curling to reveal rows of jagged teeth. I stumbled back, my flashlight dropping to the ground. For a moment I was paralyzed, unable to think or move. Then instinct took over, and I bolted back to the car. The creature roared, a sound that shook the air around me, and I heard its heavy footsteps crashing through the underbrush. I barely made it into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut as it reached the edge of the road. My hands fumbled with the keys, and the engine sputtered to life just as the creature lunged, its claws raking across the hood. The car lurched forward, the tires spinning in the gravel before catching. I floored the gas pedal, my heart racing as I sped down the road. In the rearview mirror, I saw it chasing me, its glowing eyes locked on the car. Its speed was unreal, closing the distance with terrifying ease. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it stopped. I watched in disbelief as it stood in the middle of the road, its head tilted as if it were listening to something I couldn't hear. Then, without warning, it turned and disappeared into the trees. I didn't stop driving until I reached the main highway. My hands were shaking, and I could barely breathe, but I didn't dare look back. The next morning, I inspected the car. Deep gouges ran across the hood, and there were muddy claw prints on the driver's side door. I told a few friends about what I'd seen, but most of them just laughed, chalking it up to exhaustion or an overactive imagination. I stopped talking about it after that, but I know what I saw. And I know that whatever it was, it's still out there, lurking in the shadows of Willow Creek.